The great hall stretched out like a silver ocean under the artificial stars. Katie Morrison sat in the very back row, her worn notebook balanced on her knees. She felt tiny in this place. Around her, beings from across the galaxy filled thousands of seats. Some looked like walking crystals. Others seemed made of pure light. A few had tentacles instead of arms. All of them were much smarter than any human was supposed to be. Katie pulled her jacket tighter. The air here was cold and smelled like metal and ozone. She had been on this space station for 3 weeks now, and she still felt like she did not belong. Back home on Earth, people called her a math genius. Here, she was just a curious pet that the aliens allowed to watch their important meetings. Stage at the front of the hall glowed bright blue. Professor Zixthara stood in the center, her crystal body catching the light and throwing rainbows across the walls. She was 12 feet tall and looked like someone had carved her from living diamond. When she spoke, her voice rang like music boxes playing in the distance. Fellow scholars, Professor Zixthara began. Today I will present the greatest challenge our combined civilizations have ever faced. The Helix paradox has remained unsolved for 3,000 years. It has broken the minds of our greatest thinkers. It has ended the careers of brilliant mathematicians. Some say it cannot be solved at all. Katie leaned forward. She loved impossible puzzles. At home, she solved them for fun while other kids played video games. Her teacher said she had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. But here, surrounded by beings who had been doing math longer than humans had existed, she felt very small indeed. The professor waved her hand. Above the stage, a massive hologram appeared. Katie gasped. The thing floating in the air looked like a knot made of light and shadow. It twisted and turned in ways that hurt to look at. Lines of force curved through space, connecting points that seemed to exist in different realities at the same time. Behold the Helix paradox, Professor Zixthara announced. This object exists in 47 dimensions simultaneously. To solve it, one must calculate the quantum probability matrices for each dimensional intersection, while accounting for temporal flux variations and reality displacement coefficients. Katie blinked. She understood maybe half of those words. But as she stared at the floating puzzle, something strange happened. The impossible knot started to make sense. Not the math part. She could not follow the equations at all. But the shape itself seemed familiar, like something she had seen before. In the front row, an elf with silver hair and pointed ears watched the presentation with ancient eyes. Lirelei Moonwhisper had been studying mathematics for 800 years. She had written books about dimensional theory that other species considered masterworks. Even she looked troubled by what she saw floating above the stage. The Cerebrics Collective attempted this puzzle using their hive mind intelligence, Professor Zixthara continued. 5,000 linked brains working as one. They calculated for 7 years before admitting defeat. The Luminals tried next, using their energy-based consciousness to perceive dimensions we cannot even imagine. They also failed. More examples followed. The Chronarchs, who could see through time itself, had worked on the puzzle for centuries. The machine intelligences of the Nexus Core had built computers the size of moons just to attempt one small part of it. All had failed. Katie scribbled in her notebook, not writing math equations, but drawing little pictures. The floating knot reminded her of something. She had seen this pattern before, but where? As Professor Zixthara droned on about failed attempts and theoretical impossibilities, Katie let her mind wander. And it hit her. The puzzle looked like the mess of Christmas lights her dad pulled out of storage every December. The same tangled knots. The same way different strands seemed to go through each other without really touching. Her mom always told her dad to just throw the old lights away and buy new ones, but he insisted on untangling them every year. Katie had watched him do it dozens of times. He never used math or followed any system. He just looked at the knot until he could see which loop went where, then pulled the right strand at the right time. Sometimes he had to push one part through another part that looked impossible to get through. But it always worked in the end. The professor's voice brought Katie back to the present. The computational requirements alone should collapse any organic neural matrix. No biological brain could process the data needed for even a partial solution. This puzzle represents the absolute ceiling of consciousness itself. It is the point where intelligence meets its ultimate limitation. Around the hall, beings nodded in solemn agreement. Some looked sad, as if mourning the limits of their own minds. Others seemed proud to have tried and failed at something so magnificent. The elf in the front row stroked her chin thoughtfully, clearly already planning her own attempt. But Katie stared at the floating knot and felt excitement bubbling up in her chest. She could see it now. The pattern was actually quite simple once you stopped thinking about it as math and started thinking about it as a thing that wanted to be untangled. Like her dad's Christmas lights, it was not really trying to be impossible. It was just scared and confused and needed someone to be patient with it. The professor was winding down her presentation. In conclusion, the helix paradox stands as eternal proof that some questions are simply too large for any mind to answer. We must accept that the universe contains mysteries beyond our reach. Katie's hand shot up into the air. The entire hall fell silent. Thousands of eyes, sensors, and other sensing organs turned to look at the small human girl in the back row. Professor Zixthara's crystal form flickered with what might have been surprise. "Yes?" the professor asked, her musical voice carrying a note of barely controlled patience. Katie stood up, her legs shaking a little. Excuse me, but I think I solved it during your lecture." The silence stretched across the hall like a frozen lake. Katie could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She had never spoken in front of so many people before, let alone aliens who could probably solve math problems that would make her head spin. But the floating knot above the stage kept calling to her, begging to be unraveled. Professor Zixthara's crystal body flickered through several colors. Katie was not sure if that meant the professor was amused or annoyed. Maybe both. The tall alien gestured with one diamond-like hand toward the stage. "Please," Professor Zixthara said, her voice echoing like wind chimes in a storm. "Come forward and show us what you believe you have discovered." Katie grabbed her notebook and walked down the long aisle. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. Every step felt like it took forever. She could feel thousands of alien eyes watching her move. Some beings whispered to each other in languages that sounded like music or static or grinding metal. The elf in the front row leaned forward. In her seat, Lirale Moonwhisper had lived for 8 centuries. She had seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations. She had watched stars be born and die. But something about this small human girl made her curious. There was a confidence in Katie's walk that did not match her obvious nervousness. Katie reached the stage and climbed the steps. Up close, the floating puzzle was even more beautiful and confusing. Lines of light curved through space in impossible directions. Parts of it seemed to exist in places her eyes could not quite see. She pulled out a small device that let her interact with the hologram and started to work. The audience expected her to begin with complex calculations. They waited for her to pull up screens full of equations or request access to the station's main computers. Instead, Katie just stared at the puzzle and started moving pieces around with her hands. "What is she doing?" whispered a Cerebrix drone to its neighbor. "This is embarrassing," muttered a luminal being, its energy form pulsing with what looked like second-hand shame. but Katie ignored them all. She treated the impossible mathematical construct like a physical object, rotating it and poking at different parts. To the sophisticated aliens watching, it looked like a child playing with blocks. They had no idea that Katie was actually seeing patterns they could not perceive. "You see," Katie said, her voice carrying through the hall speakers, "everyone keeps trying to solve this like it's a math problem. But it's not really math. It's more like untangling a knot." She demonstrated by grabbing what looked like a strand of light and pulling it gently to one side. Several beings in the audience gasped as 3 of the puzzle's dimensions suddenly aligned perfectly. Katie had not done any calculations at all. She had just looked at the tangle and known which part to move. Professor Zixthara stepped closer. "Young human, you cannot solve dimensional mathematics through intuition alone. There are quantum probability matrices that must be calculated, reality displacement coefficients that must be accounted for. You are making fundamental errors that any first-year student would catch." Katie shrugged and kept working. "I mean, math is just patterns, right? And humans are really good at patterns. We had to be because it helped us hunt animals and stuff. My dad always says you don't calculate how to throw a ball at a moving target. You just know where it's going to be." She made another adjustment that looked completely random to the watching aliens. But somehow, impossibly, another layer of the puzzle clicked into place. The quantum matrices that Professor Zixthara had spent decades studying suddenly stabilized. All by themselves, Lirelei rose from her seat and walked toward the stage. 800 years of mathematical training told her that what she was seeing was impossible. But her older, deeper instincts whispered that the human girl was doing something her own ancient people had once known how to do. "May I observe more closely?" Lirelei asked, her voice musical, but nowhere near as formal as the professor's. Katie nodded enthusiastically. "Sure. It's actually pretty simple once you stop overthinking it." The elf climbed onto the stage and watched as Katie continued her work. Where other species would get trapped trying to calculate every possible outcome, Katie's human brain simply jumped to the most likely solution. She worked like someone untangling fishing line or separating jewelry chains, patient but confident, following her instincts rather than any formal system. "Your species evolved as persistence hunters," Lirelei said quietly, more to herself than to Katie. "Always finding the path that uses the least energy, taking shortcuts that still reach the goal." Ancient memories stirred in her mind. "My people once had words for this kind of mathematics. We called it walking the wind paths." Katie grinned. "Yeah, like why waste time calculating every possible route when you can just feel which way is right?" She demonstrated by solving another section of the puzzle through what she cheerfully called aggressive pattern matching. Where the aliens saw chaos, Katie saw a design that was just confused about what it wanted to be. She treated each part of the puzzle like a living thing that needed gentle encouragement rather than brute force calculation. The audience was no longer whispering jokes about primitive human thinking. A tense quiet had settled over the hall as more and more of the impossible puzzle began to resolve under Katie's touch. Beings who had studied mathematics for thousands of years watched a 19-year-old human girl accomplish what their greatest minds could not. Professor Zixthara. Confidence began to crack like ice under pressure. The helix paradox had been her life's work. She had written 17 research papers explaining exactly why it could not be solved. She had built her entire reputation on the elegant impossibility of this puzzle. Now a child from a species barely out of the Stone Age was unraveling 3,000 years of careful theory. Katie paused in her work and looked up at the professor. "You know what your problem is? You're all thinking too hard about this. Sometimes the answer is right there in front of you, but you miss it because you're looking for something complicated." She reached toward the center of the puzzle, toward the quantum knot that represented the intersection of all 47 dimensions. According to every mathematical model, this core should collapse into paradox the moment anyone tried to manipulate it directly. But Katie just smiled and got ready to try the obvious solution. Lirelai moved closer to Katie, her ancient elven senses tingling with recognition. For 800 years, she had buried herself in formal mathematical proofs and rigid theoretical frameworks. But watching this human girl work brought back memories she had almost forgotten. Stories her grandmother used to tell about the old ways, when elven mathematics flowed like water instead of marching like soldiers. Katie reached toward the puzzle's center, completely unaware that she was about to touch something that had driven civilizations to madness. The quantum knot twisted and writhed in the air, its 47-dimensional intersections creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Every alien mathematician in the hall held their breath. "Wait," Lirelai said, softly, placing a gentle hand on Katie's shoulder. "Before you continue, may I ask you something? What do you see when you look at this puzzle?" Katie tilted her head, considering the question. "It's like a really complicated knot, but not the kind you tie with rope. More like the kind that happens when you stuff all your cables into a drawer and forget about them for 6 months. Everything gets tangled up, but there's usually one spot where if you just push the right wire through the right gap, the whole mess starts to come apart." Several beings in the audience looked confused. Their translators struggled with concepts like cables and drawers. But Lirelai understood perfectly. The human was not seeing the puzzle as a mathematical construct at all. She was seeing it as a physical problem with a physical solution. "Show me," Lirelai said. Katie grinned and dove back into her work. But now she explained what she was doing as she did it, and Lirelai began to understand something that made her ancient heart race with excitement. The human was not ignoring the mathematical principles that governed the puzzle. She was unconsciously applying them in ways that bypassed all the computational bottlenecks that trapped other species. "See? This part here wants to connect to that part over there," Katie said, manipulating 2 strands of light that seemed completely unrelated. "But there's all this stuff in the way. So instead of calculating the exact path, I just kind of push them together and let them find their own route." She demonstrated, and somehow the 2-dimensional fragments slid past 3 others that should have blocked them completely. The mathematics worked out perfectly, but Katie had never done a single calculation. Her human brain had simply recognized that the system wanted to minimize its energy state and had given it permission to do so. Lirelai watched in amazement as Katie continued her work. The girl treated each section of the puzzle like a living thing with its own personality. Some parts were stubborn and needed to be coaxed. Others were eager and just needed a little encouragement to find the right position. Katie seemed to instinctively know which approach to use for each piece. "Your species learned to hunt in groups," Lirelai murmured, thinking out loud. "You had to predict not just where animals would go, but how they would react to the behavior of other animals. You developed brains that could model complex systems without formal calculations." Katie nodded enthusiastically while untangling another section of the puzzle. "Yeah, like when you're playing basketball and you see an opening in the defense. You don't calculate angles and velocities. You just know where the ball needs to go and when to throw it there." Professor Zixthara stepped closer, her crystal form flickering rapidly through different colors. Katie could not read alien body language, but she got the impression that the professor was experiencing several emotions at once: confusion, frustration, and maybe just a little bit of excitement. "This is impossible," Professor Zixthara said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "A computational load alone should have collapsed your neural pathways. How are you processing 47-dimensional quantum calculations without any cybernetic enhancement?" Katie looked up from her work with a confused expression. I'm not processing anything. I'm just looking at it until it makes sense. It's like those magic eye pictures where you have to relax your eyes to see the hidden image. You can't force it to work. You just have to trust that the pattern is there. Lirelai laughed, a sound like silver bells that had not been heard in the consortium halls for centuries. Of course, we have been approaching this as pure mathematics, but it is actually an ecological problem. The dimensions are not fighting each other. They are trying to find their natural equilibrium, like animals in a forest finding their proper territories. The implications hit several beings in the audience like a physical blow. If the most challenging puzzle in galactic history was actually a problem about natural systems rather than abstract mathematics, then everything they thought they knew about the limits of intelligence might be wrong. Katie made another adjustment, and suddenly, a whole section of the puzzle that had been writhing in chaos settled into peaceful harmony. She wiped sweat from her forehead and grinned at her growing audience on the stage. The thing is, she said, this puzzle is not really trying to be impossible. It is just confused. Like when you wake up in a strange place and forget where you are for a second. All these dimensions got tangled up somehow, and now they can't remember where they belong. They just need someone to help them find their way home. Professor Zixtara stared at the human girl who was casually dismantling 3,000 years of mathematical theory. You speak of mathematical constructs as if they have feelings and desires. Katie shrugged. Maybe they do. Or maybe thinking about them that way just makes it easier to understand what they want to do naturally. Either way, it works. She turned back to the puzzle, now more than halfway solved. The remaining sections seemed to sense that help was coming and began moving on their own, trying to position themselves for easier untangling. Katie worked with their movement instead of against it, like a dancer following music only she could hear. Lirelai found herself remembering stories her people told about the early days, when elven magic was not about controlling reality, but about cooperating with it. Katie's approach felt like those old tales come to life. The human girl was not conquering the puzzle through force or cleverness. She was simply helping it become what it wanted to be all along. The center of the puzzle began to pulse with a warm, steady light. Katie stood before the final challenge. The center of the puzzle pulsed like a heartbeat, its light growing brighter with each passing moment. This was the quantum knot that had broken the minds of civilizations, the impossible intersection where all 47 dimensions tried to exist in the same space at the same time. According to every theory, every model, every calculation performed over 3,000 years, this core should collapse into paradox the instant anyone tried to touch it. But Katie did not see an impossible mathematical construct. She saw something that was scared and alone. "Oh, you poor thing," she said softly, reaching toward the pulsing light. "You're not trying to be difficult, are you? You're just all tangled up and don't know how to fix yourself." Professor Zixtara's crystal form went completely still. "Do not touch that directly. The quantum feedback will destroy your mind. We have safety protocols for a reason." Katie paused, her hand inches from the glowing knot. "But it's not dangerous. Look at how it's moving. It's not angry or chaotic. It's just confused." She studied the pattern for a few more seconds, then smiled. "I know what this is. It's having an identity crisis." Lirelai blinked in surprise. "An identity crisis?" "Yeah, like when you look in a funhouse mirror and can't figure out which reflection is really you. All these dimensions are trying to be themselves at the same time, but they keep seeing each other and getting confused about who they actually are. They're stuck in a loop of second-guessing themselves." Katie reached out and gently touched the quantum knot. The audience gasped, expecting to see the human girl's consciousness scattered across 47 dimensions. Instead, something beautiful happened. The knot stopped pulsing erratically and began to glow with steady, warm light. "There you go," Katie whispered to the mathematical construct, as if she were calming a frightened animal. "You don't have to. Choose which dimension you want to be. You can be all of them at once. That's what makes you special." The quantum knot seemed to sigh with relief. The self-referential loops that had trapped it in paradox began to untangle themselves. Where there had been impossible contradictions, Katie's gentle acceptance created space for all possibilities to coexist peacefully. Professor Zixthara stumbled backward, her diamond body flickering through colors that had no names in any language. "This is not possible. The computational requirements alone should have liquefied your brain matter. You are performing calculations that require processing power equivalent to a stellar computer array." Katie looked genuinely confused. "I'm not calculating anything. I'm just being nice to it." She made another small adjustment to the knot, and suddenly 3 more dimensional layers aligned perfectly. See? It just needed someone to tell it that it was okay to be complicated. The watching aliens struggled to process what they were seeing. Their greatest minds had approached the Helix paradox as an enemy to be defeated through superior intellect and advanced technology. Katie treated it like a friend who needed help. Where they saw chaos that must be controlled, she saw a natural system that needed to be understood. Lirelei moved closer to observe the quantum knot's transformation. 8 centuries of mathematical study had taught her to think in terms of proofs and theorems, but Katie's approach awakened older knowledge. She remembered elven children playing games that looked like nonsense, but somehow always led to elegant solutions. They called it dancing with problems instead of fighting them. "The humans evolved as social creatures," Lirelei said quietly to Professor Zixthara. "They learned to solve conflicts through empathy and cooperation rather than dominance. She is not conquering this puzzle. She is making friends with it." Katie continued her work, humming softly under her breath. The quantum knot responded to her gentle touch like a flower opening to sunlight. Dimensional intersections that had been locked in impossible paradox began to flow naturally into their proper configurations. The mathematics worked out perfectly, but Katie had never looked at a single equation. "Almost there," she said encouragingly to the puzzle. "Just let go of trying to be perfect. Perfect is boring anyway. Complicated is much more interesting." With one final delicate adjustment, Katie helped the last dimensional layer find its place. The quantum knot exploded into brilliant light, but not the harsh light of destruction. This was the warm light of a problem finally understanding itself. The 47 dimensions settled into perfect harmony, no longer fighting each other for space, but working together to create something more beautiful than any of them could achieve alone. The helix paradox was solved. Where the impossible knot had writhed in confusion, now floated a mathematical flower of stunning complexity and perfect simplicity. Its petals were made of pure mathematics, each one containing fundamental constants that described how reality itself worked. The solution was so elegant, so obviously correct, that everyone who looked at it wondered how they had ever thought. It was impossible. The great hall fell silent, except for the soft humming of the station's life support systems. Thousands of beings stared at the floating flower, their minds struggling to accept what they had witnessed. The greatest puzzle in galactic history had been solved by a 19-year-old human girl who thought math problems had feelings. Professor Zixthara's voice came out as barely a whisper. How did you process calculations that should have required the combined computing power of multiple civilizations?" Katie wiped her hands on her jeans and smiled. "I didn't process anything. I just looked at it until I understood what it wanted to be. Human brains are really good at that kind of thing. We had to be, or we never would have survived long enough to build spaceships." She gestured at the beautiful mathematical flower floating above them. This puzzle was never really impossible. It just needed someone to approach it with kindness instead of force. The implications spread through the audience like ripples in a pond. If humans could solve impossible problems through intuition and empathy, what other challenges might yield to their unique perspective? What other mysteries were waiting for someone to treat them as friends rather than enemies? Lirelei looked at Katie with new respect. You have shown us something, my people. Forgot long ago, mathematics is not a war to be won. It is a dance to be shared. Katie grinned. Everything's more fun when you do it together. 3 months had passed since Katie solved the impossible puzzle, and the Galactic Academic Consortium had never been more alive with excitement. Research teams that had worked in isolation for centuries now collaborated across species lines. The quiet halls buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages, as beings shared ideas they had never thought to share before. Katie found herself at the center of it all, though she still felt like the same small-town girl who had arrived here on a lucky scholarship. She sat in what used to be Professor Zixthara's private office, now converted into a bustling workspace where humans, aliens, and elves worked side by side on problems that had once seemed hopeless. Lirelei leaned over Katie's shoulder, examining her latest project. The elf had become Katie's closest friend and study partner, helping translate human intuition into mathematical language that other species could understand. Together, they had developed what the consortium now called biomimetic mathematics, treating complex problems as living systems rather than dead equations. So this transportation paradox, Katie said, pointing at a holographic display showing tangled lines of force. It looks just like the subway map back home when they're doing construction. Half the lines don't go where they're supposed to, but people still figure out how to get where they need to go. Lirelei smiled. Katie's ability to find familiar patterns in the most exotic problems never stopped amazing her. And how do people navigate when the system is broken? They ask for help, Katie said simply. They talk to other people who know different routes. They share information and work together to find solutions that nobody could find alone. A crystalline chime announced Professor Zixthara's arrival. The tall alien had changed dramatically over the past few months. Where once she had been rigid and formal, now she moved with something approaching playfulness. Working with Katie had taught her that precision and flexibility could coexist beautifully. The Transportation Committee is ready for your presentation, Professor Zixthara announced. Her voice still rang like music, but now it carried warmth instead of cold authority. Though I suspect they are not prepared for your proposed solution. Katie grinned and gathered her notes. The universal transportation paradox had puzzled galactic civilization for 2,000 years. How do you move goods and people efficiently between star systems when space itself behaves differently in each region? Traditional approaches involved massive calculations to predict and compensate for spatial variations. Katie's approach was typically human and typically simple. They walked together through corridors filled with beings from across the galaxy. Katie waved at a group of Cerebrix drones who were learning human brainstorming techniques. She high-fived a luminal energy, being who had discovered that emotions could actually improve mathematical accuracy rather than hinder it. Everyone she passed smiled or made whatever gesture their species used to show friendship. The presentation hall was smaller than the great auditorium where Katie had first solved the Helix paradox, but it was packed with transportation engineers from dozens of worlds. They sat in neat rows, data tablets ready, expecting another lecture full of complex theories and mathematical proofs. Katie walked to the front of the room and activated a simple holographic display. Instead of showing equations or dimensional models, it showed a picture of her hometown's main street during rush hour. Traffic jams happen because everyone tries to take the most efficient route at the same time, she began. But humans figured. out a long time ago that the best solution is not to make the roads perfect. It's to help people communicate and cooperate so they can share the roads better. She clicked to the next image, showing the galactic transportation network as it currently existed. Rigid shipping lanes connected major systems, but vast regions remained isolated because the spatial conditions were too unpredictable for standard navigation. You've been trying to solve this by making space behave consistently, Katie continued. But space doesn't want to behave consistently. Different regions have different personalities, just like different neighborhoods in a city. Instead of fighting that, why not work with it? She demonstrated her solution using an interactive model. Instead of forcing ships to follow predetermined routes, her system would let them communicate with each other in real time, sharing information about spatial conditions and finding flexible paths that adapted to changing circumstances. Ships would travel in loose groups, helping each other navigate difficult regions and sharing the computational load of complex calculations. A Chronarch engineer raised a tentacle-like appendage. But this requires unprecedented levels of cooperation between competing commercial interests. The logistics alone would be impossible to coordinate. Katie shrugged. Humans do it all the time. We call it talking to each other. She pulled up examples from Earth's internet, showing how millions of people shared traffic information, weather updates, and travel recommendations without any central authority coordinating their efforts. You don't need to force cooperation. You just need to make it easy and rewarding. Professor Zixthara stepped forward to provide technical details that supported Katie's intuitive insights. Lirelai added mathematical frameworks that made the human approach accessible to more formal thinkers. Together, the three of them had learned to combine their different strengths into something more powerful than any of them could achieve alone. The presentation continued for 2 hours, but the real breakthrough came during the question period. A Vortanian engineer asked how the system would handle edge cases and unexpected failures. Instead of providing a detailed contingency plan, Katie simply said, "The same way humans handle unexpected problems. We adapt, we help each other, and we figure it out as we go." 6 months later, the first test convoy successfully completed a journey that should have taken 2 years in only 3 months. The ships had discovered 7 new stable routes and helped each other through 12 spatial anomalies that would have destroyed any single vessel traveling alone. The success exceeded even Katie's optimistic predictions. The Impossible Problems Division, as it had come to be known, now occupied an entire wing of the research station. Katie, Lirelai, and Professor Zixthara co-directed teams working on challenges that had stymied galactic civilization for millennia. Their approach was always the same. Treat problems as friends instead of enemies. Look for cooperation instead of domination. Trust that solutions wanted to be found. Katie stood in her office late one evening, looking out at the stars through the viewport. Lirelai joined her, carrying 2 cups of the herbal tea they had both grown fond of. "Any regrets about leaving home?" the elf asked. Katie accepted the tea gratefully. "Sometimes I miss my family, but I think this is where I'm supposed to be. There are so many problems out here that just need someone to be kind to them." Through their window, they could see ships from dozens of worlds docking at the station, their crews eager to share new discoveries and collaborate on impossible projects. The galaxy had learned that intelligence was not about having the biggest brain or the fastest computer. It was about knowing when to be gentle, when to be patient, and when to trust that even the most complicated problems just wanted to be understood. Lirelai smiled and raised her cup in a toast to impossible problems and the humans who solve them by being nice. Katie laughed and clinked her cup against Lirelai's. To making friends with math and proving that the universe is a lot friendlier than anyone thought. Outside their window, the stars twinkled like they were laughing too.